Hey everyone, welcome to a deep dive into a topic you were curious about, that tricky line between democracies and authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, how can you really tell them apart when things get messy?
Exactly. We're diving into that today with Eris Trantidis' 2017 article, Is Government Contestability an Integral Part of the Definition of Democracy?
From the journal Politics.
Right. Now, this article really digs into why just holding elections doesn't actually equal a true democracy. And honestly, it's more complicated than you might think.
It really is. I mean, Trantidis starts off by tackling this big debate.
Yeah.
What actually is a democracy? Everyone uses that word, but nailing down a definition.
Oh, it's way harder than it looks.
Exact.
It's like you can't say you're a baker just because you own an oven, right? You need the actual,
Ingredients.
yes. And some folks, they focus on those ingredients of democracy, the procedures, elections, voting rights. Are those basic rights even written down? But
Yeah.
as Trentidis points out, it doesn't always work that smoothly.
Yeah, he brings up this concept of contestability,
Mhm.
which is basically asking, is there a real chance someone else could win?
Okay, so it's not just about going through the motions of an election.
Yeah. And that's where polyarchy comes in, an idea from scholars like Robert Dahl. They agree elections are key, but for true democracy, you need actual competition.
So just having elections on paper isn't enough.
Right. Think of it like a baking competition where the same person wins every year. Even if everyone technically follows the rules, you'd start wondering, is this really fair?
Right, right. Like, is something fishy going on behind the scenes? And Trentidis actually gives some pretty stark examples, like Belarus under Lukashenko.
Or Russia under Putin.
Mm.
They have elections, sure, but it's the same leader or party winning constantly, often by these huge margins.
Suspiciously huge, some might say. So that leads to the big question, if the outcome seems predetermined, even if the voting itself is, like, technically correct, can you really call it a functioning democracy where citizens have the power?
That's the heart of the debate Trantidis throws us into.
So are those systems automatically dictatorships then? Or is there more nuance to it? I mean, it can't be that cut and dry, right? They can't all be dictatorships, but I see why you'd think that.
Right. It's not quite that simple. The article points out that these regimes, the ones with low contestability, they often use these, well, sneakier tactics to hold on to power.
Oh, so they're not always, like, using tanks and openly rigging elections?
Exactly. Trantidis calls it soft manipulation. It's almost like, imagine a chess game,
Okay.
and one player just kind of subtly nudges the board, just enough to throw their opponent off, but without technically breaking any rules. These regimes, they might not resort to, outright violence or blatant election rigging, but they create this environment where going against them incredibly difficult.
Okay, so what does that look like in real life? What is soft manipulation in practice?
Think about things like patronage, giving government jobs and contracts to people who support you, or pork barrel politics.
Where they, what, funnel money to certain areas?
Yeah, to specific regions, specific interest groups, all to gain their loyalty. And of course, you can't forget state-controlled media,
Right, controlling the narrative, making sure the ruling party looks good.
shaping public opinion, discrediting anyone who speaks out against them, that kind of thing.
But hold on, doesn't some of that happen even in democracies? I mean, we see pork barrel spending projects all the time, and let's be real, media bias is definitely a thing.
You're absolutely right, and that's what makes this tricky. These tactics, they exist on a spectrum,
This,
right?
so how do we draw the line?
The difference, as Trantidis explains, is in how widespread it is and the stakes involved. In these more authoritarian-leaning systems, this soft manipulation, it's everywhere. And the consequences of opposing the regime, way higher. It creates this atmosphere of fear that's honestly pretty similar to outright repression.
So it's less about, like, actual laws being broken and more about the feeling of, like, always having to watch what you say.
Exactly. Imagine being afraid to criticize the government, even when talking to your friends, because you're worried about losing your job. Maybe they audit your taxes as revenge.
Or suddenly you can't get your business permit renewed.
Right. It's a way of controlling people without, having tanks roll down the streets. But make no mistake, the effect on actual democratic freedoms is real.
So we're not just talking about a few biased news stories here and there. This is systematic.
Exactly. And what's insidious is that it can be hard to spot from the outside. International observers, they might even give a country a passing grade on their elections without realizing what's really going on.
This is getting really, really fast. So if these tactics are so subtle, how can people even realize what's happening? And then how do you fight back against that kind of, like, invisible pressure? This is really making me think differently about, like, the news I see every day. But I'm sure some people listening are like, okay, interesting stuff, but does this actually matter to me? Like, I'm not a political scientist.
You're totally right. Not everyone geeks out on this stuff like we do. But think about it this way. Understanding the difference between elections on paper and real democratic competition, that's like a superpower these days. You can cut through the noise and see how democracies can be weakened, even in places you'd think are super stable.
So it's about like being able to spot when a government is saying one thing about democracy, but doing another behind the scenes.
Yeah, and that awareness, it's huge because then you start asking the right questions about everything. Like, is this new policy really about the economy? Or is it just helping out the ruling party's buddies?
Or cracking down on protesters? Is it really about national security, or are they just silencing critics?
Exactly.
This has been eye-opening for sure, but for someone listening who's not, a political science expert, what's the key takeaway here?
Well, Trantidis leaves us with this really thought-provoking question. He says that real power in a democracy comes from people taking action together, right? Organizing, protesting, holding their leaders accountable. So what happens if those things get harder or even impossible, even without violence or censorship? What happens to democracy then?
Wow. Yeah. It makes you realize democracy isn't something you just get. It's something you have to constantly work at.
Absolutely. It means staying aware, asking tough questions, and supporting those groups fighting for transparency, being an engaged citizen, even when it's a pain.
It's a journey, not a destination, right?
Exactly.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive, that's for sure. Thanks so much for breaking this down for us.
Happy to be here.
And to everyone listening, we hope this gives you a lot to chew on. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.